Good morning, everyone. It is a delight to be among this illustrious group of sisters to present our ideas and with the wonderful men and women of the panels throughout the day. I'm going to speak to you today about data that was pulled together while I was the executive director of the Emerging Models of Pastoral Leadership Project. It was compiled by Kara, and it is still available for crunching and noodling down there, and I'm going to pull some of the basic thoughts that they came out with around the issue of lay ecclesial ministry and its status in the church. Back in April, Pope Francis, in a speech on the importance of marriage in society, commented, "Why should it be taken for granted that women must earn less than men? The disparity is pure scandal." Of course, few of us gathered here would disagree with the Holy Father, but we might also concede a point that New York Times columnist Frank Bruni made when he said that this comment was, quote, "an epic mismatch of messenger and message." Bruni asserted that neither Pope Francis, and this is a quote, nor any other top official in the bastion of male entitlement known as the Vatican can credibly assert concern about parity between the sexes. Their own kitchen is much too messy for them to call out the ketchup smudges in anybody else's. Never afraid to assess Catholic trends, or for that matter, the pattern of ketchup smudges, Mark Gray of Kara, the nonprofit research center that conducts social scientific studies about the Catholic Church, decided to cover the pay gap in his 1964 blog. And what he found was noteworthy. But before we look at the question of pay equity, I think it's useful to take a look at the demographics of those who are employed by the parish church so we understand the group that we're considering. In 2013, there were more than 17,900 parishes in the United States, according to the USCCB. The total number of paid staff in those parishes is approximately 70,000 people, not including the priests and the deacons. Of all the paid lay staff, I'm going to focus this talk on the group we give the title lay ecclesial minister. These are people who are, for example, pastoral coordinator or moderator of a parish, pastoral associate, director of religious education, youth minister, campus minister, hospital chaplain, etc. They are overwhelmingly college educated, and most hold graduate level degrees. What our research revealed is that lay parish staff, on average, is aged 58. More than 80% of those people are women. It's also noteworthy that our data revealed that only about 1 in 20 lay ecclesial ministers are of the millennial generation, in other words, born in 1982 or later. If we look at the data, and unfortunately I had this all on charts and a PowerPoint that has disappeared into technology difficulty, so if you're interested in seeing these charts, we'll be sure to have them available to you on the website. But if you were to look at all the data about how the race and ethnicity information shapes up around parish lay ecclesial ministers, we would discover that 88% of this group, that is 80% female, is white. 9% are Hispanic, 2% are Black, 5% are Asian, and 5% self-identify as other. So when we're talking about lay ecclesial ministers, we are discussing, for the most part, middle-aged and older white women. We should note, though, that this demographic is not tracking with the demographics of the North American church as a whole, or where that church is trending. And it's very important to highlight this because we are at a moment, hopefully, where this entire nation is taking the next steps of looking at the embedded racism in the United States And we need to acknowledge that the U.S. Church, despite a hundreds-of-year-old African-American church and a hundreds-of-year-old Latino church, has not equitably enfranchised either African-American leadership or Latino leadership in its lay ecclesial ministry, nor in the diaconate, nor in the priesthood. So that's the snapshot of who we're talking about. And that data was captured, as I mentioned, by Mark and his CARA colleagues while I was the project director. This data was culled from 3 national surveys related to parish life and leadership, and one of them was shaped by the National Association of Church Personnel Administrators, otherwise called by its acronym NACPA. So what did we do? We surveyed 5,701 people who work in 433 randomly selected parishes, and that is a statistically valid representation of the national church. Now, keeping in mind that parishes also rely enormously on a big cohort of unpaid persons. So we aren't talking about those, we're talking about salaried people. What did the salary data reveal? The emerging models NACPA data revealed that the average salary for lay ecclesial ministers, the people I just described, is $32,000 a year. Let's look at that number in light of the wage gap. Using the emerging models data, Mark discovered that women lay ministers actually make 11 cents per dollar less than their male counterparts. He then compared the 11-cent less gap to the gap at the White House among employees, and in fact noted that the Catholic Church is doing better than the White House. The White House has a 12% gap, a 12-cent gap, and of course, nation as a whole, we have about a 23-cent gap. And Mark commented, although a gap still exists, the situation in the church is apparently better than the White House or the country as a whole. And while Mark is technically correct, it is 1 cent better, he did not focus on the point that deserves highlighting. The average salary for women in the White House is $78,400. That would be $46,400 more than the $32,000 average salary for a woman who's serving on a parish staff. So despite my friendship with and my great appreciation of Mark, I will say that I don't agree. I would say that the situation in the church is not better than the White House or the nation as a whole. Let's take a look at the, may I have your water? Oh, please. Let's take a look at the average salary of lay ecclesia ministers compared to other jobs. If you were a medical assistant, you would make a comparable wage, $30,550. If you were the assistant manager at McDonald's, you would make a comparable wage, $33,000. There, the gap starts to jump. If you were a public school teacher, your average wage would be $56,000. An associate professor of theology, something of interest to me, as a recently minted PhD, $59,000. If you were a Target store manager, a place I frequent often as a mother of 3, before your bonus, you would make $65,000. And if you were a registered nurse, $66,000. And of course, you could always choose to be an Uber driver. And that would be $74,000 if you were in San Francisco. So let's think about the factors that have contributed to this chronically low compensation. Salaried lay ecclesial ministry, while not new in our lives, is in fact new in the life of the church. The term did not even exist 50 years ago. And the Second Vatican Council, while calling for the increased involvement of the laity in the church, did not envision that as involvement in salaried leadership, but rather the council saw it as the engagement of lay Catholics in the world in the matter of leaven, expressing their faith through their discipleship wherever they were found. And the model was, and it is referenced in the documents, Catholic action. However, after the council, we saw this incredible surge of interest among lay people to participate in the organizational life of the church. At the same time that this then unforeseen form of ministry was happening, we saw a decrease in vocations to religious and priestly life. Chuck Zeck, and of course the data here the chart I would have liked to have shown you is a number of 180,000 approximately religious sisters at the close of the council to the number of 50,000 religious sisters, including the retirees, in 2014. Chuck Zeck of Villanova, who researches trends in parish administration, described the situation this way. The non-ordained vowed religious have always been an important while inexpensive pool of labor for parishes. I would add they have also been an exploited pool of labor for parishes. Back to Chuck. They've traditionally been a critical source for parochial school teachers and other vital parish ministries. Those positions still must be filled. More and more frequently, they are now filled by professionally trained lay people who deserve compensation from the parish in accord with their professional credentials. One can't help but wonder at how the gender discrimination of centuries of undercompensated women religious has simply taken a new form in the compensation of the laity in parishes. Unlike teachers and nurses, two occupations that in prior generations were overwhelmingly female, that now have livable wages, church ministry compensation remains low and has not kept pace. Now, I'd like to do a little aside about the priests. In his blog, Mark also notes that priests, in fact, receive the lowest wages in the parish at an average of $12.60 per hour, which rounds out to $15,000 to $18,000 per year. However, the perks of the priesthood, allowances for housing, food, car, various types of insurance, cable television, telephone and cell phone, landscaping and other property maintenance, housekeeping, snow removal, etc., make up more than we would need to make up to accommodate that pay gap. We then can add to that unmonitored cash stipend income, Christmas gifts. I don't know about you, I never heard of this before. The clergy handshake, where someone's slapping a 20 to you, I guess. Guaranteed retirement housing, if we ever let them retire, but that is an entirely different talk about an injustice that our brothers are facing. Zero academic debt, as Nicole mentioned, continuing education allowances, and tax benefits from the U.S. government. It is clear that our priests are, for the most part, doing just fine financially. Duke University research pointed out that while Catholic pastor income is among the lowest among Christian clergy, the added provisions that I just listed make, and this is a quote, the Roman Catholic model the best model for financial quality of life among clergy as a whole. Now back to ecclesial ministers. How do wages shape up when we look at compensation by role? Kara has crunched that data, and it's a useful chart. It moves from $55,000 at the level of lay administrators. Male lay administrators make $55,000. Lay women make $40,000. That is the greatest per dollar pay gap. Interestingly enough, in a role that is more disposed to be a male role. Pastoral ministers, the salary gap, $39,000 versus $35,000. young adult and youth ministers, 36 and 31, and so forth. With only one exception, the gap for lay ministers, the discrepancy favors men every time. Now, given that our Catholic social teaching calls for just wages, it's also important to consider this ministry compensation model in light of the current poverty threshold. Circling back and keeping in mind that lay ministers on average earn $32,000, consider that right now a 4-person family, 2 adults and 2 children, is at the poverty level with annual cash income below $23,000. MIT's work on a living wage, 2 adults and 2 children, and I'm going to quote the state of Ohio out of the heartland, home of Chris Shank, indicates that the required annual income for a family of 4, a living wage, is $56,193. That is a $24,000 gap. As early as 1940, the U.S. bishops prioritized the importance of a living wage for workers. In their statement on the church and social order, they wrote, "The first claim of labor, which takes priority over any claim of the owners to profits, respects the right to a living wage." By the term living wage, we understand a wage sufficient not merely for the decent support of the working man himself, but also of his family. A wage so low that it must be supplemented, and this is a statement of its time, of course, in terms of the gender language, a wage so low that it must be supplemented by the wage of wife and mother or by the children of the family before it can provide adequate food, clothing, and shelter, together with essential spiritual and cultural needs, cannot be regarded as a living wage. That is 75 years old. I'm going to move past my diocese data because Chris shared it with us. Many people are asking, why don't we see a younger, more diverse cohort pulling up behind this aging, white, female lay ministry group? Well, there are significant differences between today's young adults and those of prior generations, especially in terms of workplace style, monetary expectations, and technology use. I think Kathleen Cummings, director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism at the University of Notre Dame, got it spot on when she said, quote, "They've grown up in a world where all doors have been open to them. And it just strikes a disconnect when they see the church with no female leadership. At least they're not the ones at the altar." I will add that right now, 90.5% of lay ecclesial ministers report directly to a priest pastor. And only 71% of those people have a job description.
Wow.
So, while the lack of access to avenues that follow ordination, as we've heard earlier, is a justice issue, I would like to add that the lack of representation of women in leadership is not limited to the Catholic parish or the diocese. The majority of the heads of houses in Catholic publishing are male. The majority of executive directors of Catholic ministry professional organizations are male. The majority of Catholic theologate faculty members are male. The majority of published Catholic liturgical composers are male. The majority of Catholic theologians are male, although women are slowly closing that gap. And the majority of consultants, of myself being one, assisting in parish mission and vision casting is overwhelmingly male. Often people point to the bad giving among Catholics as justification for unjust personnel situations. Again, according to Villanova's Chuck Zeck, since the pattern was first discovered in the 1970s, Catholic households have contributed to their church at about half the rate of their Protestant friends. During the last 4 decades, the typical household has reliably contributed 1.1 to 1.2% of its income to the parish. During the same time, the typical Protestant household has reliably contributed 2.2 to 2.5% of its income to its congregation. And median Catholic household income is exactly the same as median Protestant household income. Chuck observes, if U.S. Catholic households simply gave at the same rate as their Protestant friends, U.S. Catholic parishes would realize another $8 billion in revenue each year. In other words, Catholic collection revenue would double. Getting to that level, I would say, would require a momentous rebuilding of trust that could only come about through complete financial transparency at the parish and diocesan level. Finally, and by no means least, I want to comment on how women in parishes and dioceses are almost entirely in roles that are subject to the vicissitudes of priestly leadership, as we've heard. They are at will, church employees are at will. They are vulnerable to the likes and dislikes of new pastors who consider regime change part of their purview. In addition to transition vulnerabilities, lay workers can be fired, as mentioned, due to perceived personal lapses tied to morality clauses, such as living with or marrying someone of the same gender, accessing birth control or in vitro fertilization, having a child out of wedlock, and more. In addition to not having job security, there's frequently a lack of any form of due process to address accusations that the individual has acted in a way that is in conflict with, quote, the doctrine, the teachings, the laws, and the norms of the Catholic Church. Not long after he was elevated to his office, Pope Francis called upon us to develop a new theology of women. I would argue that the issue is not the articulation of a theology of women, but a new articulation of a theology of authority, a theology of responsibility, a theology of mature obedience, healthy dissent, a theology tied to identity and vocation, all of which would serve us far better. So those questions are the ones that I would love to see the Holy Father address as we seek to operationalize what I would hope would be a dialogical church empowered by a ministry of equals that includes the meaningful organizational leadership of women. Thank you.